Rollo, a man of imposing stature and eyes that reflected the vastness of the seas, was more than just a warrior. He was a faithful Housecarl, a sworn guardian of a Jarl respected and admired by all. Since he was young, Rollo carried the axe with the dexterity of someone who had been shaped by cold and battle. When the Jarl announced the journey to the west, Rollo promptly placed himself at his side, ready to protect the one he considered almost like a father. They set off with the north wind pushing them, never imagining that the calm waters could hide storms. In a clearing where the forest was as dense as the secrets of men, they were ambushed by 15 wild and emblemless Vikings. Steel cut the air, metal thunder echoed, and the ground soon turned red. In the end, despite fighting with the fury of the ancient gods, Rollo saw his Jarl fall, his last breaths evaporating in the cold mist. With a heavy heart but his honor intact, Rollo returned to his kingdom, believing that he would be received with condolence and respect. But fate can sometimes be as cruel as the edge of a cursed blade. As he stepped into the village that had once hailed him as a hero, Rollo was met with steely stares and venomous murmurs. Whispered accusations quickly turned to shouts, calling him a murderer and a traitor. The chains that wrapped around his wrists weighed more than steel, for they carried the pain of injustice. Trapped in the heart of the city, amidst the cold stones and scornful looks, Rollo found himself surrounded by invisible enemies. Now, the real battle was not against swords and axes, but against the sharp tongues and hasty judgments of his own people. And proving his innocence had become as vital as wielding a blade in the middle of the battlefield. Rollo was not born into noble birth, but his strength and determination were forged in the harshness of life. From an early age, he learned that the world was not kind to the weak. Raised among warriors, he wielded a blade before he even understood the weight of honor. As a young man, he enlisted among the warriors of Jarl Sigurd, a leader whose reputation echoed throughout the coast. Over time, Rollo proved his worth in fierce battles, raising his blade alongside the bravest. When he was finally given the title of Housecarl, an elite guard of the Jarl, he knew that his life was no longer his own. It belonged to duty, blood, and loyalty. Sigurd, in turn, was a Jarl to be respected, not only for his strength, but for the wisdom that guided his people. His kingdom, Skagenfjord, was a prosperous port surrounded by mountains and unforgiving waters, a haven for traders and warriors alike. Sigurd ruled with a firm fist but a generous heart. Rollo and Sigurd were not just lord and vassal, but brothers in the sword, united by battles won and cups raised in glory. In campaigns to the east, they had faced Saxons and Franks, conquered lands, and brought riches to Skagenfjord. It was an alliance built on war and strengthened by unshakable trust. Now they would set out west, seeking alliances and new opportunities for their kingdom. The day of their departure dawned with the roar of the sea, the wind blowing like an indecipherable omen. Rollo buckled on his chainmail, sharp as ever, and took one last look at the city he called home. Sigurd, beside him, smiled, confident that they would return triumphant. The crew was ready, their shields gleaming in the pale morning light. But no amount of forged steel could prepare them for what was to come. The voyage began under a gray sky, where the clouds moved like silent omens. The sea was rough, but the boats held firm, cutting through the waves with determination. The crew continued in silence, each man immersed in his own thoughts, as if they sensed that this journey would not be just another crossing. Rollo, sitting near the bow, sharpened his axe, feeling the weight of the blade in his hands. Sigurd, for his part, remained standing, observing the horizon with his calculating gaze. He was not a man of empty words, but when he spoke, each syllable carried the gravity of an experienced commander. After days of sailing, The group landed on an unknown coast, where the land stretched out in vast green fields. They set up camp, resting before heading inland. The mission was simple: establish contact with a distant settlement, seal alliances, and secure new trade routes. Riding through dense forests and treacherous hills, the warriors kept their attention sharp. Nature seemed to be watching them, the wind whispering through the branches as if it wanted to tell them a secret. Rollo felt a strange weight in his chest, an uneasiness he could not name. On the morning of the 5th day, the party had shrunk. Only Rollo and Sigurd rode ahead, leaving the other warriors behind. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather an exchange of mutual trust. The Jarl smiled at the corner of his mouth, as if he wanted to say something but saved the words for a more opportune moment. The sound of hooves echoed along the dead path as the two of them continued deeper and deeper into unknown territory. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky with reddish hues, when Rollo finally broke the silence. But before he could speak, a strange rustling in the trees made his senses sharpen. Something was lurking. The ambush happened too quickly for either of them to fully react. 12 shadows emerged from the surrounding vegetation, while 3 more appeared behind, cutting off any escape route. Rollo instinctively drew his sword, while Sigurd already had his axe firmly in his grip. The silence was broken by a fierce shout, and in an instant, the attack began. Blades flashed in the fading light. The clang of metal on metal echoed through the forest, and the hooves of horses recoiling from the ground sent sparks flying. Rollo leaped down from his mount in a swift leap, dodging a blow that would have split his head. Sigurd, even though he was older, fought like a cornered wolf. His axe sliced through the air with deadly precision, splitting skulls and felling enemies without mercy. But the attackers were too many. They were not here for ordinary plunder. This was a planned assassination. Rollo realized too late that their intention was not a simple theft of goods or horses. When one of the enemies grabbed his arm, he quickly threw it away. But when he looked at Sigurd, he saw the inevitable. A spear pierced the Jarl's torso, and time seemed to slow down. Rollo's roar of fury echoed across the field as his lord's body fell to the ground. Sigurd's blood stained the ground like a bitter tribute to the gods. Rollo fought with blind fury, but the attackers retreated after the Jarl's death. He fell to his knees beside his friend's body, the sound of the wind now a wail. When he looked up, the assassins had already disappeared, leaving behind only the dust and the weight of betrayal. His heart hammered in his chest. He knew that no one would believe his word. He knew that returning home would mean facing an even greater storm. And deep down, he felt that this was only the first piece in a much larger game. The smell of death hung in the air even before Rollo saw the bodies. He made his way back to the shore, where the warriors who had taken them across the sea must have been waiting. Instead, what he found was a massacre. Bodies lay strewn across the beach, some still clutching their weapons, others slumped over broken shields. The sea lapped at the blood-stained sand, while seagulls hovered overhead, drawn to the carnage. The ships, burned, reduced to charred wreckage that floated on the waves. Someone had wanted to make sure there were no survivors. And now Rollo was alone. He knelt beside one of the fallen warriors, an old friend from battles past. He turned the body, only to find empty eyes staring into space. His fists clenched in fury, but he knew that shouting into the wind would bring no answers. The attackers, whoever they were, had been meticulous. They had left no obvious marks, no sign of who they were or where they had come from. But one thing was certain: someone wanted Sigurd dead. Someone wanted Rollo not to return to tell his side of the story. With the boats destroyed and no trace of survivors, the only way out was to head inland. After wandering for hours, he found a fishing village, a small settlement hidden between cliffs. The people looked suspiciously at the blooded warrior who had emerged from the mist, but an old man, recognizing Sigurd's coat of arms on his torn tunic, decided to help him. They offered him shelter for a night and, the next morning, promised to take him back to his kingdom in one of their boats. Rollo didn't say much, just stared at the horizon with somber eyes. He knew that when he returned, he would not be received with honors. Something told him that the real traitors were waiting for him, ready to throw the accusations on his shoulders. And, deep down, he felt that his fight was just beginning. For much of the journey, the only one who knew the route was Ivar, Jarl Sigurd's brother. Rollo's return to his kingdom was very different from what he had imagined. As he approached the gates, the silence of the streets and the sharp looks of the villagers revealed that his arrival had been expected. The doors of the fortress were open, but not in welcome. Before he could even open his mouth to tell what had happened, a group of guards advanced on him, pulling him from his horse and throwing him to the ground. "Arrest the traitor!" one of them shouted. Rollo tried to resist, but the combined strength of the warriors immobilized him. He did not even have a chance to explain. The looks that had previously carried respect were now of contempt. Dragged into the great hall, Rollo felt a weight on his chest when he saw who was sitting on the throne that had previously belonged to Sigurd. Ivar, the Jarl's brother, stood at the head of the council, a cold smile on his face. "Rollo, the traitor dog, finally returns," he said as he leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the arm of the throne. "You killed my brother and ran away like a rat. Now you will be judged as you deserve." The accusations were spat out like venom, and there was no one willing to listen to him. Among the warriors gathered in the hall, some seemed to hesitate, but no one dared to speak out. They threw him into a cold, dark cell, without any explanation. His hands were tied with rough ropes, and the taste of blood in his mouth still reminded him of the brutality with which he had been captured. Outside, the guards murmured about his sentence. Death. The weight of the treason they accused him of was too great for anyone to believe in his innocence. But Rollo knew that if he wanted to survive, he would need to find a way to prove the truth, before it was too late. Rollo's prison was not exactly the kind of place one would expect to find allies. The cell was damp, with stone walls that reeked of salt from the sea and the rot of the narrow passages. The sound of chains and the echoes of the prisoners' voices made the atmosphere even more suffocating. But, nevertheless, something unusual happened. Beside his cell, a hoarse, old voice, that seemed to come from the depths of some ancient nightmare, caught his attention. "Looks like the dog is locked up, huh?" It was Eric, a man with scars from many battles, but with a cunning that came from a life of crime and the underworld. Apparently, he already knew everything about Rollo and what had happened to Sigurd. Eric had lived most of his life in the shadows, but his cunning was far from lost with age. "Listen, comrade," he began, a smile barely visible through his thick beard. "I can help you get out of here. I'm no longer a man of strength, but what I have left, my friend, are my connections and my mouth. And you have something I don't, muscle." He paused, as if to make sure Rollo was paying attention. "I can't get out of here alone. Not without help. But you have what it takes to break these chains and the resistance of this city." Rollo looked at him suspiciously, but knew that this proposal was the only chance he had of getting out of this prison. Eric then revealed what he had in mind. "I have a group. Some call me leader, others mentor. They are thieves, bounty hunters, experts in getting out of trouble. If you help me get out of here, in return, I will lead you to them. And together, we can hunt down the real culprits. I owe Ivar a debt, and you, well, you have a much greater reason." He smiled with a calculating glint in his eyes. "Besides, who wouldn't like a little revenge, right? I can show you the way. But you're the one who's going to do the dirty work. Rollo, though hesitant, knew he didn't have many options. To survive, he would need to do whatever it took. The plan was set, and if everything went well, he would have the chance to get revenge. But at the same time, a new burden had been placed on his shoulders. It would not only be a fight for survival, but also a fight to regain control of his destiny. Rollo, with no other options left and aware that his only chance of escaping from that prison was through Eric, finally gave in to the invitation. The plan was drawn up and, although the instinct of distrust made him hesitate, he knew that this was his only opportunity. In the dead of night, when darkness was his ally, Eric put his cunning into practice. With stealthy movements, he managed to unlock Rollo's cell, and the two of them moved away from the shadows, escaping through narrow passages that only an old thief like Eric knew where they were. The silence was absolute, and, as they moved away from the prison, Rollo felt the adrenaline coursing through his body. When they finally reached the outskirts of the city, Eric guided him along little-known trails, where the cutting wind of dawn made their footsteps echo softly, but with an urgency that seemed to foreshadow what was to come. After hours of traveling, crossing dense forests and icy rivers, they arrived at a camp hidden among the mountains. Eric, upon being spotted by his group, was greeted with shouts and laughter of celebration. His return seemed to be an important event, but before he could be surrounded by the warriors, he gestured for Rollo to come closer. The warriors, upon seeing their leader return, immediately recognized Rollo as their ally. Although it was strange for him to be there, he could not deny the feeling of belonging, even if temporary. After greetings, Eric asked everyone to sit around the fire. It was time to tell the story of his journey and, more importantly, what had happened to Rollo. Eric spared no detail and recounted the betrayal, the murder of Sigurd, and the unjust accusation that weighed on the man at his side. Everyone listened in silence, and expressions varied from surprise to indignation, but one thing was clear. The bond that Eric had created with Rollo was now firm. Over the next few days, as the camp filled with feasting and celebrations for their leader's return, Rollo spent weeks observing, training, and adapting to this new world. He felt like he belonged again, yet he knew his true fight lay ahead. It was not just a matter of revenge, but of justice, and the pursuit of it would be hard. The weeks Rollo spent with Eric's men were more than just a learning of physical skills. Those days became an immersion into a world he had never imagined, a reality of disguise, stealth, and the strategies Eric's thieves used to survive. From the moment Rollo arrived at the camp, he was immersed in a routine of intensive training that went far beyond what he was used to as a warrior. The mornings began with heavy physical exercises to keep his body in shape, but it was the lessons in espionage and subterfuge that truly transformed his outlook on the world. Eric, with his experience and wit, became his mentor. He knew that in order to survive on the streets and do what he needed to do, Rollo would need to learn how to hide in plain sight, how to blend into the crowd, and how to be invisible even when all eyes were on him. "The best fight is the one no one sees," Eric would say, with a mischievous smile on his face. Rollo, at first, felt like a fish out of water. He was accustomed to direct combat, to strength and honor, but now he had to adopt a new approach. He learned to move through crowded markets discreetly, to infiltrate taverns full of soldiers and merchants without arousing suspicion. The nights, in turn, were filled with discussions and practices on how to identify and gather valuable information, or how to approach targets without raising the slightest fuss. The bond between Rollo and Eric grew in unexpected ways. At first, Eric was the old, experienced thief and Rollo the man determined to regain his honor. But over time, something more began to blossom between them. a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences. Their conversations around the campfire were more than just plans for theft and robbery. Eric spoke of his youth, when he was a knight from a small kingdom that had been destroyed by the greed of others. Rollo, in turn, shared stories of Sigurd, his jarl, and the battles they had fought together. Although different, their stories intertwined in a common thread: the search for justice in a world where it seemed so distant. The nights became lighter, and for a brief moment, Rollo found solace in Eric's friendship, something he had never imagined possible in such a cruel world. However, tension always hung in the air. Rollo knew that, despite his growing friendship with Eric, he could not remain in that camp forever. He had a mission: to return to his kingdom, regain his honor and prove his innocence. Time passed, and the weight of his destiny seemed to become increasingly clear. As much as Eric offered him shelter and new paths, the flame of revenge and justice burned within him with an intensity that could not be ignored. He knew that his return to the kingdom would be the beginning of an even more challenging journey, where he would need to confront Sigurd's brother, Ivar, and prove that he was not the murderer everyone believed him to be. But for now, the weeks with Eric's thieves represented Rollo's last chance to prepare himself for what was to come, and in the meantime, he wondered, could he regain all he had lost without losing his own soul in the process? Rollo spent weeks, months, as a man of two worlds, one foot on the battlefield and the other on his own personal journey. During this time, he and Eric had become almost inseparable, not only because of the need to survive, but because of the complicity that had formed between them. With Eric's men, Rollo learned to be more than just a warrior. He learned to blend into the crowd, to read between the lines of any conversation, to disguise himself and to collect the evidence they needed. In every village they passed, he heard secrets whispered among traders and travelers. In every tavern, he absorbed information, like a specter, and little by little, the plan of Ivar, Sigurd's brother, began to unfold before his eyes. The evidence Rollo obtained was as direct as it was devastating. Letters, testimonies, and even a detailed plan by Ivar to get rid of Sigurd and take control of the kingdom. Ivar himself, at the height of his greed, had not been able to hide the traces of his betrayal. Rollo had known that when the time came, he would have the tools to prove to his people that Sigurd's death was not an accident, but a conspiracy by a man who should never have been in a position of power. With a heavy heart but determined, he knew it was time to return, to put the truth before everyone, and finally regain his lost honor. After gathering all the evidence and mentally preparing himself for the confrontation, Rollo and Eric set off north. Rollo mounted his horse with a heavy chest, for he knew that the return to his kingdom would be anything but simple. The journey was arduous, with the wind cutting his face, but there was no longer any doubt, only the straight path to the kingdom he had once called home. Familiar lands began to appear on the horizon, the hills and fields he knew well. The smell of the earth of his homeland enveloped him in a strange way, almost like a silent warning of what was to come. Sigurd's kingdom lay before him, but something inside Rollo felt that the doors that had once been open to him were now closing. He knew that when he entered there, he would no longer be the same man. The weight of the truth guided him, but the fear of how it would all end still hung in the air. When they reached the edge of the kingdom, where the forests and fields gave way to the solid wall that surrounded the city, Eric stopped. He looked at Rollo with the eyes of someone who has seen many men get lost on their own journeys, but also with the look of someone who knows when it is time to step back and let the other go on his way. It was a moment of farewell, but not of end. Rollo felt a slight tension in the air, a mixture of gratitude and sadness, as he realized that he was about to go on alone. Eric placed his hand on his shoulder, his expression serious, but with a slightly sad smile. "Rollo," he said, his voice hoarse and deep. The world is big and full of opportunities. Whatever happens here, you know that the door of my clan will always be open to you. You have been more than an ally. If one day you feel that your fight is over, or if your honor demands more of you, you will always have a place among us. But for now, go your own way. Face what you must. Rollo looked into Eric's eyes, feeling the strength and wisdom of a man who, though he had seen his time of war pass, still knew what was necessary to survive. With one last exchange of glances, Rollo mounted his horse, feeling the loneliness approaching as Eric fell behind. The weight of the old thief's words echoed in his mind, but there was no more time to ponder. The city of the kingdom awaited him, and his honor was yet to be regained. With one last wave, he departed, riding toward the gate that would take him back to his past. The city was silent, and the wind seemed to cut through the air with more intensity. He knew that the words he was about to speak would change everything. As he approached the main gate, Rollo let out a cry that echoed throughout the city. Ivar, the traitor! I have the proof. Your brother is dead by your hand. Rollo's voice was a roar of rage and pain, filled with all the suffering he had experienced during his time away. The words traveled through the walls and reached the guards on duty, and within seconds, a curious crowd began to gather around Rollo. He could see the looks of disbelief and surprise forming, but he didn't care. What mattered was that he was finally here, with the evidence in hand, ready to expose the truth that everyone needed to hear. Sigurd's blood still stained his dreams, and he would do anything to clear his former Jarl's name. But deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning of a fight that was far from over. Rollo's scream still echoed in the ears of the crowd that was gathering, and the echoes of the accusation filled the air. People crowded the streets, curious, confused, some even fearing what might happen next. The air was thick, the tension visible in the eyes of everyone who watched the scene unfold. In the center of it all, Rollo stood firm, his chest heaving with anger and the truth in his hands. The evidence was there, in the crumpled sheets of paper he carried. He had it, but he knew he still had to face it. Ivar, the man responsible for all the lies, the betrayal and the death of Sigurd, stood before him. Slowly, Ivar's figure emerged from the crowd, his steps heavy and determined. He was wrapped in a dark cloak and had a fierce look on his face, as if he were ready to destroy anyone who dared to challenge him. Rollo could feel the hostility growing, the air becoming heavier with each passing second. When Ivar got close enough, he looked into Rollo's eyes with uncontainable fury, his fists clenched. "Do you think you have a chance, Rollo? You don't understand what's going on here." Ivar's voice was low, but filled with anger. He reached out and threw the evidence to the ground, for all to see. Silence fell for a brief moment, until people began to murmur among themselves. But Rollo's gaze remained fixed on Ivar, every word he said. "I know you lied about Sigurd's death, and I know what you did." Rollo pointed to the evidence. "And here's what you did, Ivar. Here's what you tried to hide." Ivar, with a sardonic smile, took a step forward and then looked at the crowd. The rage could no longer be contained in his face, like a wild beast ready to attack. He spat on the ground, as if he were dismissing Rollo's words and the accusation before him. "Do you think I am the only one with secrets in this kingdom, Rollo? I am the true ruler here. Sigurd was weak. He could never have led with the strength this kingdom needs." Ivar shouted, his eyes filled with madness. "You do not know what it takes to rule, nor what has happened in the shadows of our clans." The crowd was beginning to restless, murmuring in disapproval and disbelief. But instead of retracting or trying to justify himself, Ivar seemed more enraged. He advanced even further, fury taking over his body, until, without warning, He pulled his axe from its sheath. The metallic sound of the blade being removed was the signal to everyone around that this was no longer a simple exchange of words. "I will finish you, Rollo," Ivar shouted, advancing with impressive speed, the axe cutting through the air with a menacing sound. Rollo braced himself, his heart racing, but his warrior instincts took over. He would not let this man get away with it. And now, more than ever, his revenge for Sigurd had to be fulfilled. He drew his sword with a precise movement, and the steel gleamed in the sun as he positioned himself for the confrontation. Ivar, with a cry of rage, delivered the first blow with brutal force, aiming for Rollo's chest. The axe cut through the air with impressive violence, but Rollo dodged, stepping to the side and dodging the blow. The impact of the axe on the ground made the earth tremble, and he realized the power of Ivar's strength. "You will pay for this, Ivar," Rollo shouted, advancing with his sword, plunging it in a clean cut across his opponent's legs. Ivar grunted in pain, but his fury only increased. He swung the axe again, this time aiming for Rollo's head. The battle between the two became a spectacle of blades, with the echoes of the sound of swords and axes cutting through the air. Rollo, agile and focused, skillfully dodged Ivar's wild blows, while trying to find an opening to deliver a fatal blow. The surrounding crowd watched, stupefied, the deadly duel. Shouts and words mingled as the two men faced each other in the center of the square. The ground was marked by the blood of both, and the fight seemed endless. Rollo knew he had to defeat Ivar, but every move was risky. He felt the pressure from everyone around him, hoping that the truth would prevail, but his own fate was tied to that battle. The tension in the air was palpable, and everything indicated that only one would come out of that confrontation alive. The future of the kingdom was now in Rollo's hands. The fight between Rollo and Ivar was reaching an immeasurable level of fury. The sound of axes clashing against Rollo's blades echoed through the streets, and the tension was unbearable. Ivar was going crazy, striking wildly and erratically, but Rollo, with his experience and discipline, skillfully dodged, waiting for the right moment. Ivar was beginning to feel tired, and his movements were no longer as quick and accurate. It was then, at the right moment, that Rollo seized the opportunity. With a fierce cry, he threw himself forward and, with one precise movement, cut off Ivar's leg, making him fall to his knees on the ground. Ivar's axe fell from his hands, and Rollo, with a quick swing of his sword, raised the blade for the final blow. Silence fell over the square. Ivar looked at Rollo, his eyes wide with fury and fear, and then let out a sigh of defeat. Rollo's axe sank into his chest with a sure blow. The crowd, which had previously watched with apprehension, now let out a collective cry of victory. Rollo, panting and covered in blood, stood beside Ivar's body, looking around at the faces around him. The battle was finally over, and the truth, at least for the moment, had prevailed. The elders and advisers of the former Jarl Sigurd, who had watched the confrontation in silence, slowly approached Rollo. They were impressed, not only by his skill as a warrior, but by his courage in defying Ivar, the traitor. The leader of the advisers, an elderly man with a long white beard, raised his hand, drawing everyone's attention. "Rollo, son of Sigurd, you have restored the honor of your Jarl and his kingdom. Ivar's betrayal will not be forgotten, but now the truth is known to all. For your bravery, for what you did for our land and its people, we forgive you and restore your honor," the elder said, his voice firm and solemn. The crowd, which had previously been divided between fear and doubt, now applauded. Rollo's name echoed in the streets, and he was immediately recognized as the rightful heir to his Jarl's lost honor. The advisers invited him to become part of the kingdom again, to occupy a title of great importance, as a reward for his courage. But Rollo, still panting from the battle, looked at the advisors with an expression of gratitude, but also of something deeper, something that could not be easily explained. He looked at the crowd that was applauding him and at the kingdom that, despite everything that had happened, was still his home. But he knew what he truly desired. He didn't want the title or the glory. Not anymore. His destiny wasn't within those walls, with the crown and the responsibility. He had already made his decision. I thank you for your forgiveness, but my path is no longer here. My honor is restored, and my duty is done. Rollo said firmly and respectfully, I will return to my life, with the friends who have always understood me. I have found my place. With these words, he bowed to the elders and advisors, and the crowd, although surprised, understood his decision. Rollo, the Viking who had restored his honor, now turned to a different future. He walked away from the square, walking with his shoulders straight, towards the coast, where his destiny awaited him. In the distance, the figure of Eric was already waiting for him, with an understanding and welcoming smile, as if he had known that this was Rollo's destiny from the beginning. The field was clear for him. No longer the burden of the kingdom or revenge, but the freedom to choose his own path. Rollo joined Eric in his band of thieves and mercenaries, with whom he would spend the rest of his days. On the battlefield or in the shadows of the night, he would find a new life, far from the debts of the past. Free. The story of Rollo, the Viking who fought for the truth, ended in freedom, and his name would be remembered not for his victories on the battlefield, but for the courage to choose his own destiny. And so, the Viking departed, without promises of kingdoms or thrones, but with the certainty that true honor lies in living by one's own truth. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.